So today we're going to talk about the scientific method and what we call the different parts of an experiment. So the scientific method is something that you've probably talked about before in elementary school. And it's essentially a plan that scientists use to kind of answer questions that they have about the world around them. It's a set of steps that they use. So two ways that you can describe it. It's either a plan that scientists are using to investigate questions about the physical universe, or a set of steps that we follow in order to solve a problem or to perform an experiment. So when you're doing an experiment, you're basically following the steps of the scientific method. So that leads us to what are the steps, right? So there are 7 steps. Sometimes these steps are lumped together, sometimes they're spread out a little bit, but they're always generally the same. You need to start off with what we call a testable question. So what makes this different than just a general question is that testable questions are very specific. They have a clearly identified independent and dependent variable, and they basically propose an experiment that you have the time and resources to complete, or that you will have the time and the resources eventually to complete. We'll talk a little bit later about what an independent and dependent variable are, but you have to have both of them clearly identified and in the testable question in order for it to be a question that you can really do an experiment on. So once you have the question that you're trying to answer, now you have to do some background research. You need to figure out what materials you might need to do this experiment, what type of knowledge you have to understand how it's working or why it's not working. So you do some research or you gather some information about the topic. After you have your question, you've done some research, you've figured out what your experiment is going to be. Now you need to make your hypothesis. A hypothesis is basically an educated guess, okay? Since it's an educated guess instead of just a guess, you have to back it up with something. Okay, you can't just say, I think this is going to happen. You say, I think this is going to happen because, and you give some sort of explanation or reasoning for why that is your guess. Once you have your question, you've done your research, you've made your educated guess, and you've said, I think this is going to happen because, now you actually have to design and perform your experiment. Okay, so you get all your materials and your tools together, you figure out exactly how it's going to work, you actually do the experiment, okay? And as you go, you collect your data. Once you've finished your experiment and you have all of the data from your experiment, now it's time to analyze all of that data. And that can take different forms. It could just be a simple comparison. It could be doing some calculations or some math to figure out similarities, differences, the mean, the median, the mode. It could be arranging them all in a table to better look at them and compare. It could be making a graph with all the data to try to analyze and find patterns and trends. So you start to look at and analyze your data to figure out what is this data actually telling you. Once you've analyzed your data, you're going to be able to draw your conclusion, okay? And I don't mean like physically draw. You're not going to like make a picture or anything like that. Drawing your conclusion basically means looking at all of the data that you collected and answering your testable question. So you started out at the beginning with a question that you were trying to figure out the answer to. Now you have all of this data. You should be able to use that data to kind of bring it back to a conclusion and answer that original question. And then once you've done this, you need to share your results. And that can be different depending on what field of science you're in, what level of science you're in. It could be a lab report. It could be making a poster to present at a conference, writing a speech to present at a conference. It could be writing in a scientific journal or paper. In our class, sometimes it'll be a simple couple of sentences wrapping up your results and sharing. Sometimes it'll be a full lab report, but it's always important to share your results so that other people, whether it's other students, other scientists, your teacher, can kind of look at your understanding and can kind of build off of that. So we talked earlier in this presentation about having a testable question that had clearly identifiable independent and dependent variables. And those are words that we use when we're talking about an experiment. So an experiment has different parts, which is what we're going to look at next. Okay, so these are some important experimental terms that you'll hear when we talk about experiments, when we do a lab or a lab report. So they're important for you to know and understand. So we're going to talk about independent variables first. And a trick to kind of remember this is if you are an independent person, right, you're your own person, you're in charge of yourself, and you're in charge of kind of the things around you, right? So an independent variable is what you are purposefully choosing to change in an experiment, okay? So if you're trying to see how temperature affects the rate at which something dissolves, you are purposefully choosing to make the temperature between this thing and that thing different. Okay, so whenever you are purposefully choosing to alter something, that's going to be your independent variable. That's what you are in charge of making different between this cup and that cup. And on the other side, right, we have a dependent variable. So an independent variable is the thing that you choose to change. A dependent variable is basically that varied result, okay? It's the result that occurs because you changed the independent variable. So again, if your experiment was, does the temperature of the cup affect how fast a powder dissolves, right? Because you changed the temperature of the different cups, the result that that affects is how fast something dissolves. So that would be your dependent variable because the rate at which it is dissolving depends on the temperature. Another important experimental term is your control. The control is kind of hard to explain. I would say it's the hardest of all of the experimental terms to explain to someone. The way that I typically think of it and can best explain it is that it is the normal situation. And we use it as a comparison. It's important to have the control so that, like I said, you can use everything else to compare it to as like a basis, but it is whatever situation seems the most normal. And we'll talk about some different situations and we'll look at some examples of what that really means in a little bit. There are also two different types of data that you will be collecting in an experiment. So there is quantitative data, which has an N, okay, quantitative, and then there's qualitative data, which has an L there. And I like to look at the N and think that N stands for numbers, right? When we hear quantitative, it sounds like quantity, right? If you have a quantity of something, that's the amount, the number amount that you have. Quantitative data is all number data, okay? It's data that has a specific number. It is measurable. Okay, this would be like time. You can record a specific time. The length of something, you can use a ruler. The height of something, you could use a meter stick to find it. It's a number. The depth, the weight, you could put it on a scale. Quantity, you could count how many of something there are, right? All of those things are going to be a number. You can write down 39 seconds. You can write down 11 millimeters. You can say that it's, 100 grams, right? All of these are number-based because the N, right, quantitative, reminds you N number. It's a number type of data. The other type of data is qualitative. When we see qualitative, this is going to be something that is observation-based. So you can think like quality. Is it a high quality, low quality? So this is something that you can observe, but it's not going to be something that's related to numbers. It's usually based off of your senses, right? So things that you can touch, taste, see, smell, hear. So it could be describing the color of something, the texture of something, the appearance, big bubbles versus small bubbles. The smell, there's an odor that comes off of this when we dissolve it. The taste, this tastes sour, this tastes bitter, this tastes sweet. All of that is still very important data to know when you are doing an experiment, but it's not something that you can assign a number to, right? We can't say that the color is 11, right? We would have to say it's a light blue. So that's the two types of data we generally collect during an experiment. We usually collect some type of number data and then some type of observation-based data. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of experiment examples, and we're going to talk about in that experiment what are going to be our identifiable experimental terms. What would be the independent variable, the dependent variable, the control, the constants, qualitative data, quantitative data, things like that. So here's our first example. It says experimental example number 1. There are 4 bean plants in 4 different pots. All pots are receiving the same amount of water and fertilizer. The only difference between the plants is that each plant is growing under a growth light, okay, so a light that's being given to the plant, which is going through different color light filters. One plant is growing under a purple light filter, one plant is growing under a blue light filter, one is growing under a green light filter, and one is growing under a clear or non-colored light filter. And our experimental question, right, our testable question that we're trying to solve is under which color light filter will bean plants have the highest stalk growth, okay? So there's a lamp above each of these. The lamp is the same. The plants that are in each one are the same. They're in the same pots, right? The things that we keep the same in an experiment are called constants, right? It is constant no matter what pot it is, that it's the same type of plant. It is constant no matter the type of pot, that it is the same type of soil in there. The reason that those things are so important is because if you start altering multiple parts of an experiment, you don't know why your results happened, okay? So here they're trying to keep everything exactly the same between all of the different trials except for these light filters, okay? So this one essentially is going through purple light, this one's blue, green, and then clear or just regular light, okay? So if we look and we think about that experiment, we're trying to figure out what our independent variable is. So remember, the independent variable is the part of the experiment that we are purposefully choosing to change. So if we look at all of these different plants, the only thing that we have purposefully made different between plant A and B and C and D is the color light filter that they have above them. So that would be our independent variable. The only thing that we purposefully made different between each of our plants is the different colored light filters. When we look at the dependent variable, right, this is going to be the result that happens because of this changing independent variable. We are trying to determine if growing these plants under different color light filters will affect, right, the highest stalk growth. So we're trying to see if these different colored lights are going to affect how high each plant grows. So that would be our dependent variable because the height that each plant grows is going to depend on which color light filter it is growing under. So that would be our dependent variable. Next is going to be the control, right? So I said that the control is kind of hard to explain, but that it is the as close to normal situation as possible. So when we look back at our plants, we're trying to figure out which of these plants is as close to normal as possible. And you think to yourself, okay, do we normally grow plants under purple light? No. Do we normally grow them under blue light? No. Do we normally grow them under a green light? No. Do we normally put them through a clear filter or just regular colored light? Yes. So that would be our control. It's the as close to normal plant as possible. So our control is going to be the plant that's growing under this clear filter because it's getting regular non-colored light. And then we need to think about, as we do this experiment, what type of data could we collect? So if we're trying to figure out what type of qualitative data we could collect, this is going to be stuff that's observation-based and does not involve numbers, okay? So this could be something like, do the plants look healthy? Are any of the plants wilting? Are the leaves starting to droop? What color are the leaves? Are these ones starting to be a very dark green where these are a lighter green? Again, very important information to know and have, but it's not something you can necessarily assign a number to. So these would be observations that you would make. We would also need to collect number data. So that would be quantitative data. And this could be anything that's involving numbers. So we definitely know that we need to record plant height because our whole experiment is trying to figure out if the plant height is going to be affected. But you could also record things like counting the number of leaves that each plant has and writing that down, or the number of beans that each plant is producing, okay? So all of that is different types of data that we could collect that is number-based, okay, for that experiment. We're going to look at a second experiment and go through and see if we can figure out our experimental terms. So this is a different experiment, experiment number 2. And in this experiment, a student has 3 yellow glow sticks. All right, so we're gonna start off with glow sticks. All of the glow sticks are the same size, the same color, the same brand. Again, those are our constants. Those are important, right? So we know that they're not altering our results. She has her 2 sisters help her complete the experiment. Each sister cracks the glow stick to make them start glowing at the exact same time. So another constant, they all start glowing at the same time. The first sister puts her glow stick into a cup of hot water, so it's heating up the glow stick. The second sister puts her glow stick into a cup of room temperature water, so it's going to keep that glow stick at room temperature. And the third sister places her glow stick into a cup of cold water, so it's going to cool that glow stick down. So you have one in hot, one in room temperature, one in cold water. And here's the question that we're trying to answer with this experiment. We are trying to figure out if the temperature of a glow stick affects how long that glow stick will glow. So first thing that we try to find is our independent variable. This, again, is the thing that we purposefully made different between the first glow stick, the second glow stick, and the third glow stick. So when we're talking about our 3 different glow sticks, we know that they were the same size, same color, same brand. They started to glow at the same time. So the only thing that would be different here, the only thing that we purposefully changed between each of the glow sticks was the temperature that that glow stick was. We made one hot, we made one room temperature, and we made one cold. So the temperature of the glow stick would be our independent variable there. Dependent variable, this is going to be the result that happens, right, because of this changing independent variable. If we look back at our question, we're trying to figure out if the temperature of a glow stick, which is our independent variable, affects how long that glow stick will glow. So our dependent variable here would be how long each of the glow sticks lasts, right, which would be a unit of time. Okay, so that would be our dependent variable, because how long it glows depends on which temperature it was placed into. Control, okay? So again, control is the type, the trial of the experiment that is as close to normal as possible. So you think to yourself, okay, we had one in hot water. Do we usually heat a glow stick up before we use it? No, so that's not our control. We had one in room temperature, right? Do we usually just crack a glow stick at regular room temperature? Yes, so that definitely could be our control. And then we had one that was cold, right? Do we usually make a glow stick cold before we use it? No, so that's not our control. So our control here would be the room temperature glow stick because it's the as close to normal situation as possible. Types of qualitative data that we could collect. again, things that have no numbers. This could be something like how bright it's burning, the intensity, the color of the glow stick, okay? If there are bubbles, right, in the glow stick that we can see. All of those would be important information, but not number-based. And then quantitative data is going to be data that's number-based. So we know that we have to record time, right? How long each glow stick stays glowing, unit of time. You could also record the temperature, perhaps, of each cup, right? Put a thermometer in there, record the temperature. That might be important. And it's also number data, okay? So that would be the types of number data that we could collect in this experiment. So I hope going through those examples helps you to understand the different parts of an experiment, as well as kind of seeing how we would go through the experiment, coming up with our question, doing some research, making our hypothesis, doing our experiment, looking at the data, making our conclusion, and then sharing our results. So this was going over the different parts of the scientific method, how we would do an experiment, and then also the really important terms that you need to know when we actually are talking about an experiment, doing an experiment, or looking at an experiment that's already been done.